So I hope you didn't suffer too much trauma from the on-the-spot bookworm quiz I gave you last episode, Joe.
I survived it. I did fine, I think. I did not score well, but hey, we'll take it.
You got some bonus questions, so you did okay in the end.
It's true. It's true. I am grateful for the bonus potential. Otherwise, I would have been very ashamed of my results from that.
I've heard a lot of people say that they really enjoyed that part of the episode, so I'm glad you were down. Otherwise, it would have been a pretty short episode 100.
That's fair. No, it was fun. I had fun doing it too, so I'm glad people like it.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun to record. I was really happy with how it turned out. It was a good episode. So thank you everybody who has been along for the ride at any point during those first 100 episodes. We are going to jump back into the normal format here today. So we're going to cover a book here in a minute, but first we've got some follow-up from episode 99 actually. And I'll just get mine out of the way because there's nothing interesting here. I had mentioned in episode 99, which was The Motive by Patrick Lencioni. He wrote another book called The Advantage, and I said I wanted to read that one. Haven't done it yet. It's sitting on my bookshelf. Found out I purchased it a while ago. Just haven't read it yet. So we will at some point. Maybe I'll pick it for a bookworm book. You never know. But I have not read it yet, so that's my follow-up. Now, you've got a couple follow-up items here. You ready to talk about these?
Sure. These are real simple and easy to accomplish. So
yeah, these are deep.
So the main thing with reading The Motive, well, before I get there, something we did for episode 100 is I posted the recording of that to our Bookworm YouTube channel. And I don't know the interest in that, but I was looking at stats on the Bookworm YouTube channel. I haven't been good about posting things there because I didn't think it had much interest, but there's a lot of people, a lot of you are watching those. The only one that actually has video is episode 100. So I'm planning to start uploading the video of these to the YouTube channel. So just going to say that. I don't think I've told Mike I was going to do that. So Mike just learned of that.
Surprise!
Sorry, Mike.
It's all right.
Bring a quiz on me. This is what you get. So anyway, the two follow-up things I have from The Motive, what I'm trying to do is take the mindset of a responsibility-focused leader as opposed to a reward-based leader. And the two areas that I'm wanting to do this in, and the two areas that I have as separate action items here, is one is in how I lead teams of volunteers at the church. And I have 4 teams that I am the top leader of, which is tricky and dicey because they have to work with each other, and yet they're sometimes at odds with each other. So there's a fun little balance that comes with that. So I'm trying to change the way that I do things with them, specifically in the realm of making sure that I'm finding the pain points that they struggle with and trying to alleviate those, and also doing the whole management piece, because I have not really done that with volunteers. I've always been a little afraid to do that with a team of volunteers, but hey, you know, that's kind of how this stuff goes. You kind of have to do that at some point. So that's one area that I'm working on. I don't know that there's ever a done with that one. That's kind of a change the way you operate and don't ever deviate. That's kind of the way that operates. So I'm doing what I can there. I can't say that I've had a lot of success with that, other than, you know, I've got teams operating well right now, best I can tell. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is to start to apply that to the way I lead my family. And this one's proving a little more challenging, which is probably to be expected. You know, I've heard the analogy before, like the closer to home you get, the higher the temperatures get. Like things just get hotter and more intense whenever you come closer to home. That's absolutely true with something like this. And as I'm trying to adopt some of that responsibility-focused leadership style, it doesn't have clean lines as far as how you do that when you're talking about wife and kids, like for me in that scenario. So I'm still learning on that one. I don't have clean answers on that. With teams of volunteers, I can kind of cleanly see the path. With handling dinners and logistics and such just in day-to-day personal life, that's kind of a different game. So I'm working on it. Again, no answers, but I am progressing, I think.
You went full mic with those action items.
I totally did. Totally did. Pulled a Schmitz.
Yes, you did. Well, I think those are noble goals, and I encourage you in the pursuit of those action items, but we will probably not bring them up again unless you've got something you want to repeat. We're going to mark those as done for bookworm purposes.
Yeah, I would say if something happens as a result of me making those changes, I'll bring it up.
Okay.
But for now, I'm working on it. I'm totally going to pull you.
That's good enough. You can do some long range follow up if you have some breakthrough on that sort of thing.
Sure.
I'll share some right now. I don't know if I shared this with the podcast. I think I probably shared it with you. But one of the action items I had from a long time ago was to learn Spanish using Duolingo. I'm on day 376 in a row. So I'm not exactly fluent yet, but I've learned way more than I ever did in high school. I can at least have a conversation now.
Nice. So you're approaching conversational. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm approaching it. There's still a bunch of stuff I don't know, but they have these stories that you can follow along with, and it's a lot easier for me to follow along with the stories now.
Sure.
So I'm good at recognizing stuff, not good at recalling it, and the words coming out of my mouth still challenging. But that's fine. I'm just podcaster.
No big deal.
Yeah, I don't think I could say that in Spanish. Sorry. Awful louder. No hablo español muy bien.
Come on, even I know that one. And I took French.
Yo leo mucho.
Now you're going to go places I don't know.
I read a lot.
All right.
Enough about that. Let's jump into today's book, episode 101, Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. This was an interesting book. I really enjoyed this one. We'll get into some of the specifics here, and we'll do the style and rating, obviously, at the end. But I want to just kind of lay out the lay of the land. There's 10 different chapters in this book, and I've got a point under each one, basically. But some of those may be longer. Some of those we may just skip over completely. There really isn't like a simple system that he teaches in this. It's more just like a bunch of principles that you use in the negotiation. So the book starts, though, with a really cool story where he's thrown into a situation, and it sounds worse than it is at first, because the person that he's talking to is basically saying, we're going to kill your kid in a minute. And he's got to diffuse the situation. And it happened to be some higher ups at Harvard, I believe, who were putting him to the test because they had their way of negotiating based on like the business side. And he's coming in as the hostage negotiator. That's his background, as a lead hostage negotiator for the FBI. And they're like, well, what do you really have to teach us in the business realm? Is it two totally different things? And he's kind of making the point at the beginning of the book. No, negotiation is negotiation, regardless of the scenario that it happens in. Obviously, stakes might be a little bit different. But right away, it had my attention.
Yeah, he's good at that. The whole storytelling thing. This whole book is stories. I shouldn't say the whole book. He explains the stories like mid-story, which is frustrating. It's like, come on. Like, you were right to the point where he had a gun to his head, and then you skipped over to explain some business principle. Come on.
Kind of has to do it that way because he uses stories a lot at the beginning of the chapters.
Yes.
And then he uses them to illustrate the point that he's going to teach in the chapter. But unlike Extreme Ownership, where they tell the whole story and then they do the whole business story, he kind of tells the story up until the point where the principle is going to be applied. Then he pauses it, jumps over, explains the principle, and then goes back and says how it ends.
Right.
Which I get where that's frustrating from I want to know what happens next point. But in terms of learning the stuff and seeing how it's applied, I'm not sure. This may be more effective than the Extreme Ownership model. What do you think?
I would agree with that. And I'm going to compare this to I may bring this book up a number of times. This is not a bookworm book. This is before we started Bookworm, actually. I read a book called What Every Body Is Saying, and it's by Joe Navarro, who's also an FBI guy. And he also did, he didn't do negotiations, he did interrogations. And it's fascinating to me to have read that one, and then now putting this one on top of it. The book, What Everybody Is Saying, is primarily nonverbal communication and how you can interpret what other people mean despite what they say based on their body language. Whereas this one is almost entirely your words and how you say them.
Sure.
Because so much of Chris Voss's work was done over the phone or through a wall. Like, you can't see that other person.
Yep.
So it's fascinating to me to put those two side by side, because in Joe Navarro's book, he would tell the entire story and then back up and retell what happened as that story progressed, which helps you kind of get a feel for it. In Extreme Ownership, like you're saying, they told the whole story and then explained the principles. They didn't really go back through it, really. They would just kind of reference small pieces of it.
Yeah.
I really like this model way better, because he would take you to the next step and then explain. And then, like, there's some stories, especially when he would show references to the business side of it, that he would show you the very next piece and then show you what was going on inside that person's head, the other person's mind, as they were processing what to say and what the tactic was that they were doing on the next step. So I found it very interesting, because you really wanted to know what was going on next. He definitely had you hooked with each of those stories, and he did a fantastic job of holding your interest in that. And yet you got the principle as you were going through it. So yes, I like this model. I do. More people should do this. Even though, as an FBI guy, the stories from people in the military and in these Secret Service type scenarios, like, how are you supposed to put the book down? You just don't.
Yeah, this was the stories themselves were not exactly what I expected. I expected a lot of stories like the ones in the first couple chapters, but it's not just all of the crazy situations that they successfully navigated. He tells a lot of not his personal stories, but like pivotal moments in the negotiating world, and even some of their failures, which has got to be rough to talk about the times that you failed when you're talking about hostage negotiation, because that means they died. And that's blood on your hands, essentially. That's how I would view it. Like, what did I do wrong? I don't know how you like have even one of those and are able to disconnect from it and do it again. But let's jump in here with the first chapter. This chapter is called The New Rules. And the story here at the beginning is from 1971. And this isn't his specific story again, but this is kind of what set the stage for these new rules. Is in Jacksonville, Florida, there was a hijacked plane, which I guess happened all the time. That part kind of boggled my mind.
Yeah, that hijackings happened all the time. I think there was like a season where there was a lot of them.
Yeah.
Which I never realized.
Yeah. So apparently this was a fairly common thing for at least a short period of time. And the guy who had hijacked this plane had landed in Florida. I think they were going to Cuba, and they stopped in Jacksonville to refuel. And the old way of negotiating was brute force. He described it as shoot them out. And so they landed, they were going to get fuel. He didn't want to kill anybody, but as soon as they landed, the FBI agents shot out the engines because they got impatient, so the plane couldn't take off. Then he feels stuck, so he kills himself. And is there another?
There's three people. There was the pilot's wife, somebody else, and then himself.
Yeah, so there was his estranged wife and the pilot were the hostages. I can't remember if he killed both of them and then he killed himself. The pilot's wife and his daughter filed a wrongful death lawsuit, and they won, basically saying the FBI caused this, even though he's the one who hijacked the plane.
And that was because there's an important detail there that's missing. The hostages had negotiated their own way of safety. Like they had figured out how to get out of this scenario successfully. And then they shot up the plane and ruined all chance of them getting out safely. So it was because of their shoot 'em up mentality that caused that.
Exactly. It was their "we're bigger than you are" bullying approach to solving the conflict that caused the loss of life. And maybe they weren't directly responsible for those people dying, but essentially the court said that they were. So now we got to change how we do things because we can't be dealing with these lawsuits all the time.
Right.
And so that's kind of where Roger Fisher and William Ury, he talks about this getting to yes system, which is the name of a book that I've heard a lot. It seems like the kind of thing that we would maybe cover for Bookworm.
It's questionable now.
Yeah, exactly. So he's basically pushing back against this too. I'll just real quickly cover this system because I jotted it down in the MindNote file. You separate the person, the emotion from the problem. You don't get wrapped up in what the other side is asking for, but instead focus on their interests, why they're asking it. Work cooperatively to generate win-win options, and then establish mutually agreed upon standards for evaluating those possible solutions. You probably see the problem with that if you're dealing with hostage negotiation. Because, well, not all hostage takers, he makes this point later in the book, we'll get to that, but the kind of the stereotype is, I want money, I want respect, and I want a helicopter.
Yes.
And the FBI, the good guys want you to surrender and nobody to die. So these are very much at odds. There is no real middle ground if you think about it. It's not like you're just going to let the guy walk free if he hands over the hostages. So it's easy to see how, as a hostage taker, if things go sideways, you feel like you are stuck and emotions are high and you're not thinking right. So logic isn't going to work at this point. That's kind of the main thing here in this first chapter. And again, this is just kind of laying the groundwork for everything else in the book. He discusses tactical empathy here, but he discusses it a lot more in chapter 3. So I think I want to save that for now. Really, the big idea here is that life is negotiation. And it doesn't matter if you're a hostage negotiator or not. Negotiation is simply communication with results, and it serves two life functions: information gathering and behavior influencing. And so he says right in this first chapter, step 1, get over your aversion to negotiation. You have to do it no matter what.
And it seems like no matter what walk of life you're coming from and where you're at, what state you're in, you could apply a lot of this in a lot of different ways. Like, as we're going through this, think about it from a family stance, from a business stance, to things going on at church, friendships, relationships. Maybe you're doing a big salary negotiation. Maybe you're trying to buy a company. Like, these things can go a lot of different ways. So just be aware that, like, as we go through this, like, there are a lot of different ways that you can interpret this.
Yep. Negotiation is a fact of life. Just like I mentioned at the beginning, life and death isn't always hanging in the balance.
Granted, that's how maybe it's all of these chapters started.
Yeah.
Like, they all start with his personal experience in a life or death negotiation of some sort. And then, like, he would translate it into, and then here's a business world one, and then here's a student of mine, and then here's, like, he would have 3 or 4 of these, but they didn't all have to be this life or death scenario. He does do that translation for you.
Yep. It does make the tone of the book very intense.
Yes.
It feels like you're very emotionally invested in this. You're really rooting for the good guys to win, no one to get hurt, which most of the time is how it ends, but not always.
So you get towards the end of the book, and then he starts showing failures.
Yeah. We'll get there. Next chapter, Be a Mirror. This one is interesting. The whole point of this chapter is to teach a very simple principle called mirroring. And the story that he uses is, I think he said this was the first time he had been deployed in in New York for a bank robbery in 1993. And command thought that there was a big team of guys who had taken over the bank, and the lead hostage taker was the one communicating with Chris, and he had made himself to seem less important, and he was feeding all kinds of misinformation. So he was doing basically a really good job of stringing them along. And then what Chris did is he started mirroring what the guy was saying, and it's simply just reflecting back what they just said in the form of a question. And then when you do that, they open up more. And so he's doing that. The guy's sharing more information. Eventually they figure out what his name is. They share his name on air, and then he gets rattled. So he leaves, and the other guy comes on. The other guy, turns out there were only two guys who had taken over the bank. And the second guy didn't really want to be there. He had been lied to. He didn't know they were going to rob a bank.
Well, he didn't know. It was something like they were the second guy was expecting to go and like burglarize an ATM or something. He didn't realize he was going into a bank and taking hostages. Like, that's a whole different game.
Yeah. Manhattan Chase, I think they said it was. So it's like downtown New York.
Right.
Yeah. They've got hostages. He's like, I don't want to be here. So he gives himself in eventually. And then the guy who, Chris Watts is the guy, the mastermind behind all of this. Eventually, he lets the other hostages go too, and he gives himself up. So successful negotiation, all based on this mirroring practice, which he says is, the term for this is isopraxim, and it's basically imitation. When you do this, you connect with people in different ways. So, like, he uses the example of a couple walking side by side, and their strides tend to match up after a little while. That's kind of the same idea with mirroring, except he's doing it verbally because that's the only connection they have with these people who are calling out from the bank that they're holding down, and they don't have a lot of time. Like, sometimes they'll just make their demands and then they'll hang up again. So he's got limited time on the line with them, and he's saying basically the best thing you can do at that point is to mirror them in your late night FM DJ voice.
Yes, the voice matters a lot. I don't know that I could replicate that voice, but if you're a negotiator, I'm sure you have to master that one. But I found this part interesting, this whole mirroring concept, because we do this without realizing it. And I specifically, now keep in mind, I read this book 6 years ago, this What Everybody Is Saying, and I told you I was going to reference this. I did not think this book was going to come up like this. Maybe we should do it for the show now that we've done this one. But that's a thing that Navarro talks about, in that whenever you have someone else in the room that you are interrogating, you can mimic the way that they are positioning themselves, like the way that they are seated and such, and it helps them think that you're relating to them, and they're more likely to give up information when they do that, which is exactly what Chris is talking about here, in that it shows that relational piece. Like, I'm trying to help you, like, let's build this bond together. As much as the hostage taker doesn't want that, he ends up building that relationship without them realizing it, essentially. And that's what he's shooting for, that whole empathy, let me understand your side. And the easiest way to do that right away is just mirroring back their words, word for word almost, and just turning them a little bit so that they feel that connection.
Yeah, and you kind of made the point that they do it without their knowing it. That's kind of the key.
Yeah.
Is he's kind of playing dumb by mirroring things back and sometimes asking questions. Like, that's later on in the book too. But the formula here is to use the late night FM DJ voice, which is to inflect your voice in a downward way to show that you're in control. And he says, when you do this properly, it creates an aura of authority and trustworthiness without triggering defensiveness. And so an example of this is when he took over for the previous guy who was negotiating. He says, I forget the guy's name. Where's Brandon? And he's like, Brandon's gone. You're talking to me now. And he's saying it in his late night FM DJ voice. Sure. So he's like asserting his authority, like, you're not going to get to talk to the other guy anymore. You're going to talk to me. And then he starts with an I'm sorry statement. So I'm sorry that you feel that you have no options, And he's saying back, it's hard for me to come up with something off the top of my head. Maybe I should dig up the actual story. But he's starting with I'm sorry, and then he's mirroring what he is doing, saying, or feeling, and then he's just letting there be silence. And the silence is the key. He talks about different types of negotiators later in this book and how they view silence. But the silence is basically like a signal that I'm not just going to fill the void here. And then they kind of don't know what to do. And they feel like, well, maybe I need to talk more in order to be more fully understood. So they just kind of start spilling stuff, and eventually they share more than they should. And then you just repeat that over and over and over again until you get the information that you want, which is going to give you the leverage that you need to win the negotiation.
Yeah, Otter in the chat has a good point. Like, we should watch some YouTube videos of Chris talking and demonstrating this, because I feel like it would go a long ways. But there is a point after he tells his main story in this chapter where he's explaining a kind of a business scenario where a lady has a boss who tends to do these drive-bys and will, at the end of a day on like a Friday, would walk by and just make some request, but it's like a week's worth of work that they just dump on a Friday afternoon. Like, if you've ever worked in those scenarios, you know how demoralizing that is. It was not pleasant. And this lady has the wherewithal to simply say, I'm sorry, 2 copies? Because the boss had asked her for 2 copies of some paperwork, which is apparently a lot of work in whatever, I think it was a law firm maybe. And it was going to be a lot of work. So she said, I'm sorry, 2 copies? And then that forced her boss to say, yes, and I need 2 copies, by sometime next week, I think is what it was. She was like, okay, can you just verify? I need to make 2 copies, and where would you like those to be? We don't have any room in our filing system here. Like, this is the line of questioning that she's putting to him, essentially mirroring back the words that he's saying each time. It's like, I'm sorry, how do you expect that to be done? I'm getting the feeling that you are expecting X, Y, and Z from this. How do you expect that to go? And just trying to understand what he's thinking. And time it was all said and done, he told her, it's like, well, 2 digital copies, by Monday would be fine. I don't actually need anything printed, which is like 5 minutes of work as opposed to a week.
And ultimately what they wanted to have happen anyways.
Right. Who are the 2 copies for? One's for me and one's for the client. Did the client ask for that? Well, no, I just know that they generally do want that. Well, would you like me to follow up with them on that before we go through? You see how this goes.
That was pretty genius. I love that example because I could totally put myself in that situation. And I have struggled and not done very well, I think, with responding to those types of demands.
Yeah.
Because I right away see, well, this is pointless. Why would we do this? And I tend to say that, which obviously doesn't go over well.
It's because you're seeking out the conflict.
Yeah. But when you just use the formula and you say, I'm sorry, 2 copies, you're kind of implying this is ridiculous. I don't understand why. Like, Explain it to me. But you're not a jerk about it, which is where I mess up. And then they have to kind of think out loud and process this and explain it in a way that the person that they're talking to understands the motivation behind it. And a lot of times, like what happens in this scenario is that the higher up who's asking for this is they're trying to explain it out loud, not in their heads. They realize, oh, this isn't such a great idea.
Right.
Actually, we can do this other thing.
Yeah, because what she learned in the process was this boss really just didn't think things through.
Yep.
And just assumed things needed done, would throw the request on his subordinates, and they would make up for his lack of thinking. So,
yep.
Don't do that.
And this is, at this point in the book, getting into something that he talks about later on about giving the other person the illusion of control. He doesn't call it the illusion of control, but letting them think basically that they're controlling the negotiation. Because the boss at that point is thinking through things out loud, and they think they're just changing the way that this thing is going to get done on the fly. But the person who is receiving the request they, in a way, are manipulating that by the questions that they're asking to get the outcome that they want. But the boss doesn't have to know that.
No, never tell the boss.
So that's interesting.
I think he does call it illusion of control later on.
Does he? I forgot the exact term that he talked about. But yeah, I mean, when you think about hostage negotiation, that makes total sense. You want the person who has taken the hostages to feel like they are in control, not just so that they'll let their guard down, but because, like I mentioned at the beginning, it's an emotionally charged situation. They're not thinking straight. You're not going to logic a hostage taker into a right course of action. And I feel like I'm guilty of that one too. But we'll get there. Let's go on to the next chapter. Number 3, don't feel their pain, label it. So this combined with mirroring is really 80% of the book, probably, or the takeaways from the book. The story from this one is a couple of heavily armed fugitives who are holed up in a 27th floor apartment with a hostage, and they try to negotiate through the apartment door for 6 hours, no response. And then Chris comes in, and he basically is saying things like, it seems like you worry that if you open the door, we'll come in with guns blazing. It looks like you don't want to come out. It looks like you don't want to go back to jail. Because they're not even responding, he's labeling their fear basically. And as he's talking out loud, they're like, yeah, you're right. And eventually they just come and they give themselves up.
Right. They didn't even know if they were in there.
Yeah, exactly.
So it was like 6 hours, and they weren't even certain they were in the room. They were so quiet, and they didn't respond. But they just kept talking through the door, just like, here's what it looks like. Here's what we're seeing. Is this true? And then all of a sudden, they open the door and come out.
Yep. Well, not even saying, is this true, but it seems like, because really what you're saying at that point is, it appears to me that this is what's going on. And you're giving them a chance to respond. And what you really want is for them to get to the point where they confirm that is actually what's going on. That's right. That's the key. We'll get to that. But labeling is just basically recognizing and verbalizing the predictable emotions in the situation. And it diffuses those negative emotions, and it can reinforce the positive ones.
I think this is a section where he tells the story of his son on the football team. Does this sound right? Is this the right section? So his son.
I think that's later on with the 2 words. I think that's chapter 5. I know what story you're talking about, though.
Okay.
You can bring it up here if you want.
Yeah, I think because this ties in 2 different ways, and I think I'm going to bring it up here because there's a section of that story where, so his son is a little over 6 feet tall, 250 pounds in high school, which means he can run over just about anybody he wants on the football team. So he was a lineman and just loved hitting people. That was his thing. And I think it was his senior year, I forget. His coach realized he would be phenomenal as a linebacker. If you know football positions, he's now behind the lineman on the defensive side of things, and it's his job to read the line, figure out where the ball carrier is, and seek them out and destroy them, as his son would adopt.
You still get to tackle people, but your job until you tackle the person is to avoid what he was doing, just hitting people.
Yes.
Because then you get stuck.
But the problem was his son kept engaging with everyone that tried to get in his way. Like, he would just run them over, but then he wasn't doing his one job, which was to seek out the ball carrier. So his dad, Chris Voss, pulls him aside and walks him through this process. He's like, it looks like you're avoiding people. It seems like you feel it is your duty to be a man and engage anyone who wants to fight against you. It looks like that's what your job is, but your real job is to destroy the ball carrier. And his son says, that's right. Now, we'll get to that particular phrase here in a couple chapters, but his son then goes on to become very skilled at deflecting tacklers until he gets to the exact person who has the ball and then proceeds to destroy them.
Yep.
And becomes good at being a linebacker in the process.
Yeah, and since you brought up that story, I'll just mention like the key piece to that is he understood what changes to make logically, but he didn't ever make those changes because he just liked hitting people.
Right.
And when his dad would sit down and explain things logically, hey, you should avoid getting caught up in the line so you can make tackles. Yeah, you're right. Like that's always the phrase. You're right. And then when he started using the other tactics, that's when it switched from you're right to that's right as he's labeling his feelings. And then that's when the changes happened.
Yeah, and I think I think part of the reason I'm bringing this story up now, it's a little bit out of order because the whole you're right versus that's right thing is in chapter 5. But this is where, like in this book, he has a tendency to have, like at the very beginning, he's got 2 or 3 things. He's got the mirroring piece. He's got these questions of like the empathy piece that we're on right now, like trying to label what other people are feeling and show that you understand their feeling. Those pieces are kind of the core that the rest of what he does revolves around. Almost everything else, I mean, there's some tweaks to it. There's some adjustments and some nuances that he goes through in these later chapters. But like that's the core of it. And you're building off of those pieces in every other aspect.
Yep.
So I think that's why like some of these stories, like yes, technically he's referring to it later on, but at the very beginning, like it does apply because he's going to use it later on as well.
Yep. And the shift there is in focusing on the other person and their motivations. Like one of the action items I jotted down from this book comes from this chapter 3, which is don't use the word I. Because it doesn't matter how you feel. It really matters how the other person feels. If your goal is a successful negotiation, I mean, from a relationship level, you could make the argument that, yes, your feelings do matter. But when you're using it through the lens of the perspective of a hostage negotiation, it doesn't matter how Chris feels. His only job is to get the people out alive.
Right. Have one task.
Yeah. So recognize that. But I think using the word I, like I just did right there, will result in not as effective communication in general, not just negotiation. Because no one likes it when you make it about you. Those are the people that I can't stand to be around. Are the people who like don't even notice, don't really engage. Like they talk to hear themselves talk, and then they're thinking. You can tell even they're thinking about what they're going to say next. They're not interested in what you have to say. Well, when you use the word I, you're basically saying I'm not interested in what you have to say.
Right.
So
yeah, it's a tough one.
But yeah, this whole labeling thing is fascinating. Another way to use this, by the way, is to list the worst things that your counterpart can say about you and say them before the other person can. So something like, you're probably feeling like I'm a complete jerk who's going to try to bleed you dry of every cent that you have, Yep. And then you say that and they don't even have to respond, but something inside of them, if they're any sort of decent, is probably like, no, that's not what I'm saying.
The very first thing I thought of when he was explaining is like, okay, when you start this process, just explain all of the shortcomings that you yourself have.
Yeah.
Or the perception that the broader picture shows. The very first thing I thought about was 8 Mile. You've seen 8 Mile. Haven't you seen 8 Mile?
Have not.
You haven't? Okay. Welcome to the world of rapping and Eminem. Do you know Eminem, the rapper?
I do. Never been my cup of tea.
Well, even if you're not a rapper, I got an interesting, it's interesting to watch 8 Mile because essentially it is freestyle rapping. And in that world, whenever you're doing the competitions, generally you're making fun of the other rapper. Like that is what you're doing. And towards the end of it, Eminem, of course, is playing the underdog through the whole thing. And towards the end of it, he's now facing up against his rival, who has completely destroyed him in the past. I'm ruining the book or the movie for anybody who hasn't seen it.
That's okay. It's like 20 years old, isn't it?
It's not new. No. This is where the middle-age label might come in. And at the end, what Eminem does in the rap, he begins it. He starts. So there's always a back and forth. And he starts, and instead of making fun of the guy he's against, he simply makes fun of himself the entire time. And he takes everything that this other rapper was going to use against him, and he does it instead, which leaves the other guy with nothing.
He labels it, yeah.
And he doesn't even try to rap against him. So there is no competition there, and Eminem wins the rap off. So anyway, that's what I thought about whenever he was explaining the process of, show your own weaknesses and the flaws on your own side, maybe where you've screwed up in the process, as a way to give them the opportunity to say, oh, no, it wasn't that bad. Like that's essentially the response you're trying to elicit in that process. But I couldn't help but think about rap battles with Eminem. Sorry. Wasn't expecting to tell that story.
Did not anticipate we would be discussing Joe's experience with rap battles on Bookworm.
Here we are.
I think that's kind of... there's one other thing from this chapter, which I mentioned in chapter 1, the tactical empathy. This is probably worth explaining just real briefly. This is the opposite of playing dumb. He says it's emotional intelligence on steroids. So right away, I like that definition.
Sure.
Tactical empathy is understanding the feelings and mindset of another in the moment, and also hearing what is behind those feelings so you increase your influence in the moments that follow, which maybe sounds a little bit heartless when you define it that way. But again, remember his perspective. He's a hostage negotiator.
Yes.
So his job is not to create a win-win scenario. It's to get people out alive. And he makes the point here, which I thought this was really good. Empathy is not sympathy. And I think that is very important. This is when I started to think about that phrase, we don't negotiate with terrorists. And he calls it out later, so we won't deal with that right now. But
Right.
This kind of made me think like, well, okay, so you don't have to sympathize with a terrorist if you are negotiating with them, but you do have to empathize with them. You have to understand where they're coming from, whereas sympathy is agreeing with those values and beliefs. You don't have to agree with them, but you do need to understand them.
Right. And there's a big, big difference there, obviously.
Yep.
Because I'm not going to go into the details, but a couple nights ago, there's a ton of major rioting going on in the Twin Cities, Minneapolis specifically. And although I don't understand a lot of what's going on, I mean, there's a lot of charged feelings from both sides of the coin there. You don't have to have sympathy for one side or the other, but you can understand the feelings for both sides. Like people who are for or against whatever is going on. Like you can easily start to understand the feelings behind both sides, which is why I take a very neutral stance on it, because I understand both ends of that, and it's difficult to say this side's right, that side's wrong, because they're kind of both right and they're kind of both wrong. So when you start coming at it from that side, like let's have the empathy for both ends here. I think if a lot of the people there would take that approach, the whole situation wouldn't exist. But
yeah,
that's a whole nother topic in itself. But so much of this is when you're trying to come to not necessarily a middle ground, but a solution, understanding how the other person feels or the other group feels and the way your actions can be perceived, whether they're accurate or misinformed, doesn't matter.
Yep.
But just being aware of how the other person is going to feel based on your actions, that goes a very long ways. And I think that's like the core of so much of this book is just be a friend, essentially, to somebody you don't want to be a friend with.
Yep.
And try to understand where they're coming from and build a little bit of rapport and a relationship with them.
Exactly. And you don't even have to be a friend. You just need to understand where they're coming from.
Right.
And not advocate quite so much for what you want and listen to what they want and what they need, which if all you did was that, like your opinion of the people that you're talking to doesn't have to change. If that was the only thing that happened, politics in the U.S. would look so different.
Yes. So true.
ridiculous. Anyways, let's just leave that where it is. Let's
go down the politics train. Okay, all right, we can go on.
No, it is a lack of empathy. I mentioned that before. Was it Leaders Eat Last by Simon Sinek? How that kind of blew my mind. How when they stopped going to the same schools, they stopped living in the same areas, they stopped humanizing the other side, and so now it's us against them. That's not good for anybody. The next chapter kind of takes that empathy and the negotiation and how do you get to a solution. It takes it to the next level. This is beware yes and master no. He makes the point that for good negotiators, no is pure gold, and how no is really the start of the negotiation, not the end of it. Later on in the book, he talks about some ways to get that first no and use it as an anchor and stuff like that. But at this point, I feel like this is a really important thing for people who maybe haven't heard that before. How yes seems to be the thing that you're striving for because that indicates agreement. But he talks in this chapter about 3 different types of yes. The counterfeit yes, which is when your counterpart they want to say no, but they say yes just to get you to shut up and go away. It's an easier escape route. And when you define that, I'm like, I've totally done that myself.
I never do that one.
The confirmation yes, which is innocent and reflexive. It's a response to black and white questions. This is what happens a lot of times when people will get you on the phone and ask a bunch of questions because they're trying to sell you something, and they try to build that yes ladder. I have a totally different view of that now, having read this book. Doesn't matter how many times they say yes. If it's a confirmation yes, and you're going for the third type of yes, which is a commitment, this is the real deal, the true agreement that leads to action. If you really want them to take any sort of action, you need to get to that point, and you can't just lead them into it. You can't get them to say yes enough at a lower level that eventually they will do that. They have to be invested in it, and kind of the way to do that is to keep saying no and to hear them say yes over and over and over again as you force them to make these decisions for themselves. So it's different than the yes ladder where it's just obviously the answer to this is yes. You're asking stupid questions like, is the sky blue? Yes, of course it is. And the belief is from internet marketing that if you get them to say yes enough, then when you say, hey, will you give me your money? Well, yes, because I've said yes a bunch of times. But
Right.
That is a commitment yes. The other ones were like, are you sick of this? Are you, those are confirmation yeses, and they're not the same thing at all, is really the point that he's making. So you need to make the person feel safe and secure and feel like they are in control if you really want to get to that commitment yes. And the easiest way to do that is to give them the opportunity to say no.
And I feel like we need to do that more. Just in day to day, there's so many things yeah, I feel pretty good about things. Yeah, I think, these are good commitments to make. Yes, I would like to go do that. Yes, I would like to help you with that.
Yes, you should do that.
Correct. No. Crossroads, if anybody didn't catch that reference. I think there's a lot of potential in changing some of our default answers. We've talked about this a lot with the whole habit routine obsession that we have in changing default answers to a lot of different things and changing some of those responses that are just kind of confirmations. Yeah, I think it's going pretty well. Changing that to, no, I could see some improvement on that. That's minor, and it might change. It could lead to a pretty long conversation depending on who you're talking to. But if you make that slight change, I feel like in the long term, you're going to solve a lot of issues that really are just skipped over in so many scenarios. And that's a lot of what he's getting at here, is by saying no, you're opening the door to a conversation, to trying to figure out why it's not working or what is actually going on and how do we get past it. If you're just saying yes, it's just let's just swipe that off the table and move on. Now with me being a little more upset about it because I've committed to something most likely. But you get my point. Saying no, I feel like could help us out in a lot of ways. But we've talked about saying no in the past too, and yet Joe says yes.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that's easy to understand, but difficult maybe to implement, especially if you have any sort of people-pleasing tendencies like I do for sure.
I don't. None. I just wanted to say no.
Well, good for you, because there's a lot of good that comes with saying no. He talks about no has a lot of skills in this chapter. It allows the real issues to be brought forth. It protects people from making and lets them correct ineffective decisions. It slows things down so people can freely embrace their decisions. It helps people feel safe, secure, emotionally comfortable, and in control of their decisions, and it moves everyone forward. And this is the thing I think you're getting at, is that the goal should not be get to yes and then let's move on, but it should be effective communication and a resolution that's implemented well and everybody's happy with. And if you've gone through iterations of that where you agree to something, you don't want to do it, and then you resent the fact that you're doing it, eventually it's going to fall apart, and then you're going to have to renegotiate. Like, the fact that you're going back to the table and having these discussions over and over again, that's the part that always drives me nuts. It's like, we talked about this once. Why do we got to do this again? Because we sucked at it the first time. Because we weren't real with each other.
Right.
We weren't willing to show how we really felt, which, if you're dealing with relationships, people close to you, that's when things can get really tricky. But it's better for everyone if just all the cards are on the table. And this is difficult. Like, I don't know the correct formula for this. I don't think there really is one. Because you do have to balance, like, well, if I tell them how I really feel, they're going to feel hurt. You have to figure out in each of those situations, I think, a way to do it in a way that minimizes the amount of damage to the other person. But you can't shy away from, this is, a lot of times anyways, you can't shy away from, well, this is what's really going on here. This is how I see this situation. Almost every time that I've tried to just kind of sweep that under the rug, this will be fine. It's never fine. It blows up eventually. It's better to just do it of your own volition at the beginning.
Sure. As the one who seeks out confrontation, I feel like you'd be fine at this.
Depends. It depends.
Okay.
So if I know I'm going to see you every week at an organization, or even worse, I think, is at work, if I have to work with you on a regular basis every day, then I'm going to think a little bit more about bringing the conflict, because even if I see it as productive in addressing the thing that's really there, there's got to be an agreement, I think, from the other side to address the thing that's really there.
Sure.
If you and I are at odds about the future of Bookworm, and I'm like, no, Joe, we got to talk about this right now, and you don't feel like you're in the place where you want to tell me right now, like, sorry, Mike, I'm done with this.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how much I feel I'm bearing my soul and we're having this great heart-to-heart conversation, because you're not really in it. That's a totally fictitious example. That is not real, people, so don't worry.
There is no truth to that one.
Yeah.
There are not back office conversations about canceling Bookworm. Those do not exist. Now, I might be an odd cat in that, like, I feel like I have people bring confrontational things to me fairly regularly. I have spent a lot of time telling people, like, if you have issues, please come tell me. Like, I have told people that for a long time. So I feel like whenever people have something that's either me directly or something that I have influence over, generally people feel comfortable bringing that to me. I know you and I have had some conversations about, like, how do we change things up for Bookworm? And I don't ever feel like I've been difficult to approach. Maybe you would argue with that.
No,
but
I do not think you're difficult to approach.
I'm very a pain. So we also don't work together daily. We meet every other week. We have text conversations, random phone calls here and there. So it's not like it's a daily thing. So maybe that would change it.
Right.
Possibly. But
I think the frequency gets taken into the equation, basically.
Sure.
So if you're dealing with somebody regularly and you're not confident that getting to the root of the issue is really going to produce the change that you want right now, then I could foresee a scenario where you're just punting that conversation till later.
Sure.
All right, let's move on to chapter 5. We talked a little bit about this already, so there's not a whole lot I think we need to to discuss here, but this chapter title is Trigger the 2 Words That Immediately Transform Any Negotiation. You talked about the football example already, which I think was great because that's the like real life. Anybody can picture themselves in that scenario. A kidnapping story here, though, was fascinating to me. There was an Islamic terrorist group, Abai Sayyaf, that kidnapped an American, Jeffrey Schilling, and it was led by Abu Sabaya, who wanted $10 million as a ransom. And he wanted this $10 million as payment for what he termed as war damages. Okay, so there's no way the hostage negotiator is going to view these war damages like what war damages? Like, you just got to let that stuff go. That's in the past, right? But he just was holding on to this, and he was working through a translator named Benji, who absolutely hated this guy, and he had to convince him to try this approach. Once he got him on board, then he talked to Abu Sabaya, and at that point, he's mirroring and he's labeling, and he's putting himself in their shoes. And I forget what exactly the statement was, but he was basically saying, well, I can understand how you would feel betrayed by fill in the blank. And at that point, Abu Sabaya said the 2 words they were trying to hear, which is, that's right. And at that point, he's like, okay, they get me. And from that point, they dropped the war demands part of the hostage negotiation. And they held him on long enough that eventually Jeffrey Schilling escaped and he was rescued by the Philippine commandos. But this breakthrough happened kind of like right before that happened. And so he was kind of upset when it happened because he's like, well, I want to know what I would have been able to talk him down to from 10 million.
Right.
Because that was like the point of breakthrough. And then everything changed after that. You have this militant guy who just he's a fanatic. And it's tied to his religion and how he views the world. So you're not going to change his mind. And then just by labeling and understanding, having the empathy, well, this must really be upsetting to you. It's like, oh, finally, they get it. Okay, I'll talk to you now.
Right. And then afterwards, there was like a time when he called back in after Schilling escaped. And it was like, I don't know what you did, but I really wanted to kill him. Like, what?
Yeah.
Like, he was planning all these things, and he's like, I'm not sure what you did in these negotiation processes, but I was really going to go somewhere with this.
Yeah, and he talked to Benji again, and he's like, I hope they promoted you because you're amazing.
Yeah.
He was basically just puppeting what Chris was telling him to say.
It's like some of these stories, like, really?
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of this that it's like, okay, these are tactics. There are specific words, specific ways of saying these words, and ways to communicate with people, and it has a profound effect on them. And it's kind of weird. Like, when you're reading these stories, it's like, did it really go that way? Like, did it like, that's all he did, and all he did was just say, this is how you feel through an empty door, and they just gave themselves up and walked out the door. Really? Really? Like, there's a little bit of that element with some of these stories, this being one of them. I do not doubt that it went that way at all. I have zero hesitations in saying that that's exactly how it went. It just, like, man, we really are that fickle of a creature, it seems. So...
And we make things way too hard. Like, we think we got to outthink this, and he's basically saying, no, this is really a simple formula. You just mirror and you label, and eventually you get to the point where they feel like they've been heard, and then they soften or they crack.
Yeah.
All right. So a big thing from chapter 5 is get to that's right. Those are the words that you want to hear, not you're right. That's actually the worst answer. You use that when you want to get people to shut up and go away. You can use a summary to trigger a that's right response, but that's right is a stealth victory, he says. In a lot of ways, it's better than yes. I think this has a lot of application to everyday negotiating. This is something I want to apply. I want to get better at like the active listening process, where you're repeating back what somebody just said. That's a great way to get someone to say that's right, I think. not because I want to get more in a negotiation or anything, but just because I want more effective communication. That's something that I want to do a better job of. I don't have an action item associated with that because I think it has to kind of depend on the situation, but it's totally something I'm going to be more aware of and try to prioritize now in my conversations and negotiations.
That's right.
All right. Number 6, bend their reality. This one, he talks about the Haitian political figure's nephew who called and said that his aunt was kidnapped from her car. They wanted a $150,000 ransom. Again, something that happened all the time. At this point, the family is like, no, just pay it, get her back. But they don't really have the money. So they're like, can you talk them down? And he talks them down to $4,751 and a CD stereo from their initial demand of $150,000.
Yes.
Because I noticed a couple themes from these kidnappings, which were happening frequently. Mondays, there were a lot of these kidnappings, and the thugs grew increasingly eager to get paid as the weekend approached. So they just kept kind of asking the questions, saying no without saying no, stringing it along till it got later on, and then asked things in a way to kind of show that they didn't really have that much money. Even though they were prepared to give like $50,000 or $100,000, I forget what it was. It was significantly more than what they ended up at. They followed this formula where they anchored their emotions. They let the other guy go first. They established a range. Eventually, they pivot to non-monetary terms. And then when they gave a number, it was an odd one, like the $4,751. And then you add something that doesn't have any monetary value on top of it, like the CD player.
Right.
So you go back and forth. This is what you end up at, and this is what they'll take. Is kind of the takeaway from this chapter.
Yeah, you're essentially like, this is where they introduced. I believe this is where they introduced like what happens when we run out of money. Like asking that to the hostage taker. We're going to run out of money at some point. What happens at that point? And he made the comment, it'll all be all right, which is a huge win in the negotiation process because that tells them that he has no intention to harm the hostage. He's just after a payout. That's it. So that told them, like, well, this is just a string-along game until we can find something that works for both of us, and it's a pure monetary negotiation. That's what it told the negotiators. So that was a big win. But that whole, like, in doing that, it's like you're giving them that sense of, I suppose this is kind of the next one, but you're giving them the appearance that they have all of the leverage. They have the ability to control the entire situation. Again, this is where things kind of start to go chapter over chapter and they kind of flow together a little bit. But I thought that was an interesting way to pose things. Like, okay, when this happens, then what? And just asking that question, because now you're essentially putting the onus on the person who is wronging you in this case.
Yep.
On the other side of the fence, like you're putting the onus on them to solve your problem. And it puts them in a spot where they feel like they have the power, even though you're saying, hey, you have a problem. This is your issue to deal with. What do you want me to do about it? So it gives them that appearance of full power in the scenario, even though you're telling them that they have a big issue. So
the big thing from this chapter is the appearance of the deadline, how that causes people to rush in to make bad decisions. And this is really where the title of the book comes to, where splitting the difference never makes anybody happy. And the example that he uses here is that a woman wants her husband to wear black shoes to this event with his suit. He wants to wear brown shoes. To split the difference is ridiculous, where you wear one brown shoe, one black shoe. That's the worst possible solution.
Don't ever do that.
Yeah.
Please.
And so he says, we don't compromise because it's right. We compromise because it's easy. And he makes the point that no deal is better than a bad deal. So you take all that and then you apply that in the next chapter, chapter 7, creating the illusion of control. This is kind of what you were talking about. This is where the secret to gaining the upper hand in negotiation is to give the other side the illusion of control. And so this is where the calibrated questions come in. This, I think, is a really important point. This is where you were talking about they were asking the questions like how, and they say specifically use words like what, how, and sometimes why, but be careful with why because that can be a little bit accusatory, and then that can backfire. But you want to use words designed to get your counterpart to think and then speak expansively, get them to solve your problems, which is why, to your point, they were basically saying, it'll be all right. Because they were basically saying, well, this is the problem. We're going to run out of money. We don't want you to kill this guy. How do we know, it's going to be okay?
Yeah.
At that point, that they really don't have any intention of killing the person. But the story that they tell, this is one of the failures they had, like the hostage negotiation story. This is Manila 2001. Again, Abu Sabayev, he raided this private diving resort. He's taken 20 different hostages. And the day after, the president of Manila declares all-out war on this terrorist group. The Army and the Marines have a turf war. They've got several botched raids. The U.S., because there's hostages from the U.S. involved, the CIA, FBI, and U.S. military intelligence are all called in. And at this point, the kidnappers are just ticked off, and so they do a lot of bad stuff. And then 9/11 happens, and they're linked to Al-Qaeda. So he's like, in short, this was a disaster because we didn't give them the illusion of control. They called in all the cavalry.
Right.
And they had them all lined up, ready to shoot their way out, and a positive application with this, though, is that story that you were talking about where they're trying to keep this person alive. Eventually they escape, because you're putting the other person in control by offering these calibrated questions. But this is brilliant to me because a lot of times the way I think, I try to create the solution, present the solution. Hey, what do you guys think about this? And I want to not do that so much. And I want to start asking these questions in the meetings and be like, so what do you think we should do about this? Or how would you solve this problem? And just kind of see what happens with this. I've tried this a couple times already since I read this with mixed success. I think with the right group, this totally works. Especially in a business situation, though, you have to have people... You have to have an organization that is open to doing things a little bit differently, thinking critically, like they're not just walking through the stereotypical meeting.
Sure.
It's not going to work in that scenario. I can tell you from experience.
Sure.
If they got their webcams off and they're just trying to sit and endure the meeting until someone eventually says, okay, that's enough. They're not going to want to think and solve these problems. It's not going to go anywhere. But if everybody's there actually trying to solve problems, then yeah, I totally see this working.
I've had a couple of cases where I've used this in the last week where people are posing some grand technical thing at the church. And in one case, it involved a live stream on an extra day of the week. Sounds minor, but if you know that space, you're aware that means I got a computer person, I got 3 camera people, I got a sound person, I got a tech person. I got close to 8 people involved when you say, yes, we're going to live stream that. And I'm going to have extra setup, and we've got extra teardown because of normal operations.
Yeah.
So, simply posing the question, sounds great. How do you expect that to happen? What is your expectation of how this is going to work? And when do you expect all the rehearsals to happen? Well, I didn't know we needed rehearsal. You got a lot of logistics you're going to want to run through. When do you want to do that? Well, I'm not sure we're going to have time for a rehearsal. How much planning are you going to plan to do for this? You got to give me something. There's a lot involved here. Mm-hmm. This is not just a flip a switch.
Yep.
You're going to have to do some talking and explaining it. So I've used this. Great. How do you expect that to go? And me being the tech person, I'm supposed to be the one with the answers that just comes in and says, let's get it done. But I don't have the bandwidth or the people to do that. Sure, right. I'm trying to be a great leader with my team, which also means giving them space whenever they need it. And when I've got other folks hey, we're going to do this thing. Cool. Who's in charge? Who's doing what? How do I know it's going to go off? Okay. What happens afterwards? Are you posting a recording? Have you thought through all these details? No. When's the first one supposed to happen? In a week? We better go have a 2-hour meeting. We got a lot to discuss. We got a lot of decisions to make.
Yep.
So when you start explaining that very quickly it gets pushed to a, nope, we're not going to do that, because they start to realize the difficulties there. But that all came from, sure, how would you expect that to happen? When you make that decision to go live, how do you see it coming to fruition? And just asking that question in that way goes a very long distance.
And that's important that you ask the question. That's why he gives specific words to use, because it forces them to think through the details. You can't just say, so if I'm hearing you right, you want this, that, and the other thing. He says avoid verbs like can, is, are, do, or does, because if you were to list out all the things and then let them say a simple yes or no, it's easy for them to say yes, and then it's on you to go make it all happen.
Right.
But when you throw it back at them, kind of play dumb in a sense, and like, okay, so can you explain to me what this all looks like? And then they have to connect all those dots. Then, oh, you're right, this is a major undertaking.
Right. One of the questions I've asked whenever somebody poses doing a live stream, I simply present the scenario and say, okay, traditionally, when you have a service with a start time, streaming on Twitch and such isn't as big a deal because there's no official like program that starts at a set time. Bookworm's a little odd in that we do have that, but we always have like a little bit of banter and stuff we have before we say, now we're recording, which if you're interested in that, you can jump on the streams. But whenever I've got streams for a church, there's a set time. There's a countdown timer for when that service starts. And if you say, we're going to turn on a stream at 7 p.m. on Wednesday night, I got to have something about 10 minutes prior to that so that there's a feed that exists that gives people time to get it up and get it ready.
Sure.
So there's a prep time. Personally, I prefer to have about 20 minutes of just something up to give people time to get their home tech and stuff in place. Whenever anyone mentions something about like, cool idea, what would you like to have up on the screen for 20 minutes before we go live? I don't know how many live streams have been decided against because of that one question. Because no one knows. Like there's not like you know, in one case we just had a static slide with a countdown timer. Totally fine. I don't have an issue with that. It gives me something to put up on a feed. But the simple difficulty of putting together a graphic to put a timer on is insurmountable for most of these. So it's like, okay. Anyway, it gets me out of a lot of work. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, and the goal is not necessarily to get out of the work. It is to help the people that you are working with, because everybody there has got the same goal, that we're able to make the best use of our resources.
It's true. I will say, I only tend to do this when I question the motives behind live streaming it. If I understand the mission behind it right away, I'm on board, and I usually
you just make it
don't
work.
Fight. I make it work. I'll find ways to make it happen. But when I'm questionable about, is anyone actually going to watch that? Then I start posing questions like, somebody's got to help me out here because I'm not on board.
Right.
Anyway, I've run a lot of live streams. That's all I'm saying.
The Live Stream Pro.
Can we go on to the next one? I want to tell this story about a drug dealer.
Guarantee Execution, Chapter 8. Why don't you tell your story about the drug dealer?
All right, so there's a line of thinking that Chris Voss and team have struggled with, in that there's a series of questions they would generally ask to try to determine if the hostage was still alive. And a lot of times they would coach the family members who were actually in conversation with the hostage taker, the kidnapper. And there's simple questions like, can you tell me what Josie's favorite dog's name was? Like, it's these kind of like security question type things. And anytime that question comes up,
that's the traditional way you're saying, right?
Yeah, that's the traditional way. And the kidnappers, whenever they would hear this, they know that that person's being coached by the police in some way. And Chris struggled with this and could not figure out a way to get around it. Well, he was in a situation where he was negotiating. It went south. And they had two missionaries that ended up being killed and one that was severely injured. I don't remember if she died afterwards or not. But he found out after the fact that there was a kind of a rebellious senator in the local government that managed to get one of these hostages on the phone when he never got anywhere close to that. And this guy had zero training. He was purely a nobody in the name of negotiating, but he had something to win by trying to get one of these hostages back. And it bothered him that he wasn't able to get this hostage on the phone, and yet this nobody was able to do it very quickly with no training.
The proof of life. Yep.
Proof of life scenario is what they were trying to do, which is a huge win in the world of negotiations with hostages. He was called in as a consultant for a situation where there was a drug dealer in a bit of a war with another drug dealer. Drug dealer A kidnaps drug dealer B's girlfriend, and drug dealer B contacts the FBI to help him get girlfriend back. And first off, the irony of a drug dealer going to the FBI in the middle of a war with another drug dealer. Like, really? Again, you can't make this stuff up. He is coaching, and he shows up. Drug dealer B is on the phone with drug dealer A, and in the midst of conversation just says, "Hey, dog, how do I know the girl's still alive?"
Yeah, he literally says, quote, "Yo, dog."
Yo.
How do I know?
How do I know? And the kidnapping drug dealer pauses. He's like, "Well, let me go get her for you, and you can talk to her." I'm like, what?
Yeah.
All he did was like ask the question, how do I know she's still alive? And it's that open-ended question that then puts, again, the onus on the other party to come up with a solution to that problem. Now, there are a lot of ways that he could have answered that question. Like, he could have gone and picked up information and relayed that information. He could have done a lot of different things, but he chose to just put her on the phone. Like, that was the easiest way to do that, which solves the proof of life scenario. And in my head, when he was explaining all of these, like the tactics and the security questions, in my head, I was thinking, why not just ask? Maybe that's just me. Like, I'm told I have a strong intuition. Maybe that's me. I don't know. But in my head, I'm like, well, why not just ask? Like, then they'll have to figure it out. That was what my thought was. So it was fun to see that he came around to that too.
Yeah, I think the reason that they hadn't done that initially is they figured that the people they're working with or working against in this scenario are really smart, and they know they're not going to want to just put the person on the phone. And so they view these specific questions as like a way of asking for a little bit less. But by labeling, mirroring, using all these tactics, calibrated questions, you're able to just say, well, how do I know this person is still alive? Again, you're kind of playing dumb, and you're saying, okay, you prove it to me. And then instead of having them say, well, let me go find out their favorite, the name of their kindergarten teacher.
They're not going to do that.
They're just like, well, let me go get him and put him on the phone. Like, yes, that would be better. Thank you.
Yes. That solves a lot of issues.
Yeah. So it's kind of, that part was interesting to me in that, like, we make these assumptions based on things, and they're not always correct. So that's a big piece to a hostage negotiation, and literally just by asking them to help solve this problem so the conversation can continue, the negotiation can continue, they're able to get everything that they want at that particular stage of the negotiation. Right. So,
and I mean, this is an interesting section to me, because like guarantee execution, and it's basically you got to figure out how the result of what you come to is going to happen.
Yes. So there was another story, I think it was in this one, where they were the prison inmates had taken over the prison,
right?
And they didn't really want to take it over. They had captured the warden and the guards, and they realized basically, oh man, we're in big trouble. So they wanted to go back, but their solution was, well, we'll give this first guy a radio, and when he gets back, he'll tell us that I made it and nobody beat me up.
Yep.
And one of the smart guy guards along the way is like, this guy was trying to smuggle in a radio, and he took the radio. So now all the inmates who have the warden and the guards, they're like, they're about ready to go nuts. And Chris is like, you idiot, what are you doing? That was part of the deal. So he's basically saying in this point, like, it can be a bit player that can make or break a deal. So you can't just negotiate with like the CEO if you're going to put this in a business context. There has to be buy-in from the people below that too, who will actually help implement it.
Yeah, for sure. And this is where like this can come up in a lot of different ways. You're requesting money, like the kidnapper asking for money. I want $10 million. Sure, that's fine. How on earth am I supposed to get $10 million to you? I can't just go walk in with it. I don't have it on me. I'm trying to get it. It can take 4 days just to move money around. Like, what do you want me to do? How am I even supposed to get that to you? You want it in 20 hours? Like, logistically, I can't do that.
Yep.
So that's where, like, okay, we got to have this conversation about how is the result of our conversation actually going to be executed? And do we have to put it in paper? Do we have to put up a whole logistical system that we both agree to? Like, what is that? And that's where you got to ask those questions in order to get it all figured out.
Yeah, and that kind of gets into the whole section in this chapter of dealing with liars and jerks. Because he defines the process for a multi-step no, which the first part you already labeled. When someone makes a request for you to do something, maybe it's a price that they're asking you to pay for something, the initial no that you say without saying no is, how am I supposed to do that? Again, asking them to justify and create a solution for you of how you can possibly meet the demand that they've had.
Right.
So typically at that point, they come down. And at that point, the next step is your offer is very generous. I'm sorry, that just doesn't work for me. Okay, so now they have to figure out another solution. And then the third no is, I'm sorry, but I'm afraid I just can't do that. And then the last one is just, I'm sorry, no.
Right.
And they didn't have an example of this from a hostage negotiation standpoint, because I don't think you can ever get to that point where you say the last no if you are really concerned about getting the person out. That would be really hard, I think.
Yeah.
But from a business perspective, it would have been cool to see, this sort of thing happen. He does share some stories about like he's buying the Jeep and stuff like that, where he is able to use these to like negotiate down a lower price. And again, underlying all this is the fact that a bad deal is worse than no deal. So you got to be willing to walk away. But I thought this was kind of genius, this multi-step no.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
One other thing from this section, which I thought was really cool, by the way, is the 738-55% rule. And this is the rule for how much we like somebody. 7% of how much you like somebody is based on their words. 38% is based on their tone of voice. And 55% comes from their body language and their facial expressions. I don't know how accurate that formula is, but it makes sense to me. And it's really, I think it's cool to think about it that way.
It's fun to put numbers to it for sure.
Yep.
Especially considering like the part he works with is the 7 and 38 and the 55 isn't there at all.
Right.
So he's not working with much.
Yeah, you don't get to see people. All right, move on to the next one.
Yes.
All right. Number 9, bargain hard. This is where he tells the story of how he negotiated a brand new $36,000 Salsa Red Pearl 4Runner down to $30,000, even though it was the only one in the area and the guy could have charged whatever he wanted.
Right. And all he did was say no.
All he did was, really? Yep, he was ready to walk away. And so, but the big thing from this, I think, is the types of negotiators. So he talks about analysts, accommodators, and assertives. So an analyst is methodical and diligent. They're not in a big rush. Their self-image is linked to minimizing mistakes. They'll take as much time as it takes to get it right. They hate surprises. They're skeptical by nature. Silence to them is an opportunity to think. Then there's the accommodator. And what's important to an accommodator is building the relationship. As long as there's free-flowing information, it's time well spent. They love win-win. They want to remain friends. They're very easy to talk to. They're much more focused on the person behind the table. And then there's the assertives, where time is money. Their self-image is linked to how many things they can get accomplished, how productive they are. Getting the solution perfect isn't as important as getting it done. They're fiery people who love winning above all else. They want to be heard, can't listen until they've been heard. Silence to them is an opportunity to speak more. I like these definitions. Which one do you think you are?
I'm an accommodator, almost 100%. If I'm not, like, when I deviate from that, I would be the analyst.
Okay.
I'm almost certain on that. If there was a test, I would take it. But
yeah,
I feel like I'm such a people-pleasing yes person for the most part. I've gotten a lot better, but I tend to want to make sure that we're on good footing no matter what happens. So that's where a lot of if I'm negotiating, and that's where I tend to land.
If you had to pick one, which one would you say I am?
I would say you're probably the analyst.
That's what I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, that's where I would put you.
I think I'm an analyst with, honestly, accommodator and assertive tendencies.
You always do this. You always think you're all of them.
No, I think I am primarily an analyst.
Okay.
I think that I have come a long way in being assertive, and I don't like the term assertive as they apply it here, because assertive really is kind of like in between aggression versus deference, in my opinion. That's kind of the ideal. But assertive, as he defines it here, is I'm just going to talk until I get my way.
Sure.
So I don't like labeling myself that way. But as he's talking about some of this stuff, if I'm honest with myself, I do that sometimes.
Yeah.
But I also, in the past, have been I want to please everybody. And I think I've grown a lot in that area where I'm better at that than I used to be. I probably still deal with that a little bit. But ultimately, I want facts. Yeah. I'm totally the analyst. And I want to stop and I want to think about things before I say things. This is interesting to me, observation I had with my experience with Toastmasters. I love Toastmasters. I love giving the speeches. I hate table topics.
Okay.
I am so terrified of table topics where they give you the topic and then you talk for just a minute or two.
Sure.
I have so much trouble with that. And I've gotten better because I've forced myself to do it. But still, to this day, that scares the snot out of me.
I feel like that's a place I excel. Like,
give me enough time to research stuff. I'll talk forever. But
yep.
No.
I feel like when I was in high school, I did extemporaneous speaking a little bit. And there were times I had some of the judges say, "Are you sure you didn't prepare something for this?" Like, no, I just can ramble on things. So I'm not saying it's always 100% solid, but that's what I can do sometimes. Sure. I do know there are cases like, yes, I'm an accommodator. I can flip over to analyst in certain scenarios. I can specifically recall a couple different scenarios when I was in the corporate world in some meetings where we were discussing a decision that we needed to make. And we essentially ended up with two sides where we were debating back and forth around those. And the other person that I was in the middle of this conversation with was an assertive, back at it now, was an assertive person who just wanted to talk until I said yes to his side. And I just remember at one point...
Your counterfeit yes, just to get him to go away, right?
Totally. So I remember at one point in the middle of that, I just asked, "How long are you going to talk?" Like, I just asked, because we'd been in there for 2 hours. And I hadn't had a chance to really say much of anything. It's like, how long are you going to talk? We're not going anywhere. You're just saying whatever you can think of, and we're not going anywhere. I remember I apparently didn't have much respect for my position at the time because this was a superior's superior, and just like, what are we going to... I don't understand. And I remember, thankfully, he just said, "Well, what do you propose?" And then I pitched my side of it, and he's like, "All right, I'm good with that." Like, okay, what did we just do the last 2 hours? Like, what was that? So I can switch over from that. That had nothing to do with me trying to be accommodating of him. I just here's the raw fact. You're just talking. You're not saying anything. You're just talking.
Just get me out of here.
So let's be done. So the sad part about that is I did learn to do that, where you could just talk for a very long time and not actually say anything. Like in the world of corporate, like that kind of is a skill you have to develop to some degree.
Well, this is my other action item from this section, is to identify other people's styles. And I don't know I'm going to be able to do this 100% of the time, but I have kind of applied this to a couple different meetings and people that I know in those meetings. And again, not trying to manipulate or anything, but I do think understanding who you're talking to and how to kind of speak their language makes sense. Because he does have some tips for, like, when speaking to analysts or as an analyst, smile when you speak. When I read that one, I kind of laughed because I've been told that a bunch of different times. So that right there labeled me as an analyst.
Sure.
But I think there's value in figuring out, what is the right way to make the communication with this person effective. It doesn't matter what my preference is. It matters that I speak in a way that they understand it. So I want to try to do that going forward. But this is one of those action items that I'll never be able to mark done. The typical Mike action item.
That's what you do.
Yeah.
That's what you do.
True. And you, apparently.
Now, you've taught me well. Thanks, Mike.
Yep. All right, last chapter. Find the black swan. From the term black swan, I think the people who are listening to Bookworm probably recognize this from the author of Anti-Fragile. He's got a book,
Nicholas Taleb,
on black swans, but it actually comes from a 17th century English term. I did not know that because no one had ever seen a black swan. So the assumption was always the next swan that you're going to see is going to be white. Then this Dutch explorer went to Western Australia. He saw a black swan and everything changed. So the kidnapping story in this section is one of the failures that he talks about, because there was this guy who had demanded a shootout with the police at 3 p.m. where he was going to start killing hostages. He makes this demand at 2:30, and 3 o'clock on the dot, he does exactly what he says he's going to do, and then basically gives himself in to be shot by the sniper. So really the lesson that they learned from this is they've always assumed that they want respect, they want money, and they want the helicopter. That wasn't the case. This guy in particular wanted to be shot by the police, which is kind of bizarre when you think about it, but that's his whole point, is that you can't just assume that you know what the other party wants because you've been through a bunch of different negotiations like this before. And in this particular case, obviously, is really sad because somebody died. But there's application with this outside of hostage negotiation, fortunately, for the rest of us who are not Chris Voss.
Right. Yeah, I'm not going to even try to relay that story in its entirety. That one was hard to read.
It was, yeah.
It's disheartening what sad state people can get to and what they'll go through. This man had no interest in negotiating from the moment he got up that morning. So,
yep.
All right, that aside, the concept of a black swan in the midst of a negotiation or in the midst of, a debate, essentially you're trying to pay attention to the subtleties of what other people are saying, because there's likely an underlying something behind things. This is where the empathy piece comes in. Like, you're trying the best you can to become aware of what the background is behind this person. There's a story in here about a tobacco farmer, who loads up a manure spreader, I believe, and drives it to D.C.
Parks it in the National Mall.
Says it's full of organophosphate, which is technically a fertilizer, and farmers can get it in big quantities, but it is highly explosive. So these people know that. He parks the tractor and threatens to blow everybody up. They put snipers on him, of course, and they start negotiating. In the midst of conversations with him, they find out he's a veteran. They find out that his modus operandi is to go 3 days, and if help hasn't come in 3 days, they're free to sacrifice on their honor. So they know they have 3 days before he potentially is going to blow things. So they know that. So now they've got the deadline. But in the middle of this back and forth, they find out the subtleties of what he's saying. He's a devout Christian, which I have all kinds of concerns with. Like, how did you get to that point and have those beliefs? Like, I have some personal things with that. But that aside, they find out that he's a devout Christian. The following morning is a significant day in his religion. So they simply mention that in the middle of their next conversation with him the next morning. He pauses and then gives himself up immediately.
Yep.
And it's all because they uncover this one little tiny detail that is behind so much of this person's personal life, his personality, his entire being, his mission in life, they uncover that one detail, that black swan, and that changes the entire conversation and ends the negotiation.
Yeah, and they define black swans in this case as information that, if discovered by the other side, will change everything. And he's got this hypothesis that each negotiation has at least 3 black swans. So in this particular story, the fact that he's a veteran and he's got this honor code where they've got 3 days to negotiate with this guy, and then his religion, which again, not exactly painting a real positive picture here.
Thanks, dude.
But I get it. Yeah. What is interesting for me is that these black swans, they are leverage multipliers. There's positive, negative, or normative. He explains the 3 kinds of leverage here. Positive is the ability to provide or withhold things that your counterpart wants. Negative is the ability to make your counterpart suffer. And normative is where you use the other party's norms and standards to advance your position. Obviously, I don't want to use this negative leverage, but when you listen again, and listen some more, you can discover these black swans. And the reason that a lot of times these black swans don't get discovered is simply that we're just not going to listen. This is where that he mentions the phrase that I mentioned at the beginning, we don't negotiate with terrorists, and how that drove him nuts that this was a policy, because that meant that when they're negotiating or not negotiating with these radical terrorists, they're not even trying to understand how they're thinking. And he's like, that's a failure point. And he makes the point here that no one is immune to this view that the other side is crazy. He also says at the moment we're ready to say that the other side is crazy, that's usually the best moment for finding the black swans.
Sure.
So it's like, you're not getting anywhere, you're at the point where you're saying this is completely pointless, and then aha,
right.
This is where you discover these things. And I think this is the big takeaway from the entire book, is that you don't need to sympathize with people in order to empathize with them. Going back to one of the earlier chapters, you don't have to agree with people's values and beliefs, but you do have to understand them if you want to have an effective negotiation. And I think I've been guilty of they're crazy in the past, and I am challenged by this whole book and all of these stories that he tells about negotiating with terrorists. Like, these are not the people that you want to talk to, but these are exactly the people that you need to talk to. So applying that to my own life, all of the stuff that's going on in the world right now, and I don't want to have some of these conversations, but I need to. And not because I'm going to completely agree with any one side, but I need to at least understand all of these sides. And I need to understand how they're feeling, how they're approaching things. And I think it's so easy to just surround yourself with people who are just like you, stay in your echo chamber, and it's all good. Doesn't matter to me. It doesn't affect me. And I think more and more as time goes on that's not a good approach. We should be asking these questions. We should be having these conversations. We shouldn't try to avoid honest, clear conflict. But if we want to have any sort of resolution, we got to go into it with an open mind and be willing to listen.
Yes. I don't know what else to say with that. I feel like it's a good place to end things. Like, I'm out of things to say about this book. So I think I'm good for action items, unless there's something else you want to cover, Mike.
I'm good. We can talk about action items. I've got a couple. Looks like you don't have any on the document anyways.
I don't.
All right. Well, I guess I'll go first then. So I mentioned both of them in the conversation, but not use the word I, because that instantly shifts the spotlight onto me and my feelings, which to a certain degree does not matter when I am communicating with people. I want to prioritize the other side, and I'm really challenged by this book to empathize with them and to understand where they're coming from. Part of that, I feel, is the second action item, which is to identify other people's negotiating style. I don't think I could be quite as brash as you were in your example, be like, okay, so why are you still talking?
Yes.
But I've definitely felt that, and I feel like I communicate that with my my facial expressions. So I want to kind of curb that, be a little bit softer in the approach, and again, put myself in the other person's shoes and identify like why are they doing what they're doing? What are they after? Because I feel like that'll help increase the quality and the effectiveness of the communication.
That's fair. Well, I have no action items here, Mike. And it's because like this fits into the category of developing intuition to me. This whole book does. That was the way I came away from What Every Body Is Saying by Joe Navarro. Like it wasn't really anything that I had where this is the thing I'm going to do. It was, here's just a way that I can understand communicating with other people. And I feel like this is similar because the thing with it is it tends to paint things as like a you versus me. And I don't always want things to be that way. I get that relationships kind of are that way when you break them down. But for the most part, like this is adding to the box of developing intuition for me. That's kind of the way I saw it. So I didn't have anything specific for this because like this could easily play into the action items I talked about at the beginning of becoming a better leader. This could fit into that. So I feel like there's some bigger pieces there that would be more applicable, but I don't have anything specific here.
All right. Fair enough.
Style and rating?
Yeah, I really enjoyed this book. I think there's a lot to be gained from this by just about everybody. You don't have to be a salesperson in order to benefit from this. Although that's kind of the thought I had going into it. I understood that he was a hostage negotiator. I figured there'd be a business application. Wasn't sure if it was really going to go any further than that. I think it really does though. I also think that going through all of the ratings for episode 100 kind of tempers what I would rate this book because I really, really enjoyed it. I got a lot out of it. It doesn't, however, feel like a 5-star book to me. In the past, maybe I would have just because I really enjoyed reading it. I don't know. The stories that he tells about his hostage negotiations were fascinating to me, but I also kind of don't want to go back and read those again. Like once was enough.
That's fair.
This doesn't feel like one of those timeless books to me, and I'm going to continually go back to never split the difference and cite things from it. He mentions a lot of stuff in here, which I think is kind of like tent poles to his arguments, which are things that came from other books that we've read. He mentions thinking fast and slow. He mentions loss aversion, prospect theory. He mentions the black swans, so there maybe is a limited amount of new material in this, but the application obviously is very unique and like being told by the lead hostage negotiator for the FBI, that's not something you're going to get from other leadership or communication books.
Right.
So I really like this book. I did get a lot out of it. I've got some action items from it. I'm going to put it at 4.5. And I think, had I not just gone through and looked at all the ratings and seen what is in the 5-star tier, especially after we made some adjustments in the last episode, I might have been tempted to rate this 5 stars, but it's a really good book. It's just not one of those that belongs in the Hall of Fame, I don't think.
That's fair. I will join you at 4.5. I think that's right where it needs to land. I don't think it hits gold level, as you're calling these now, of bookworm books. But I think as far as books that help you get a good understanding of how people tick and how to have conversations so that you're on the same level and you both feel comfortable with the outcome of a conversation or a debate or a decision-making process, I would highly recommend this one to go through that. I would probably tell you to read What Every Body Is Saying at the same time, like to read those two in conjunctions, because now I'm curious about maybe we should bring that one on to Bookworm because I think it would be interesting to have this one under our belt and then have that one as one to come to. So that one might come up soon. I'd like to reread that one anyway. So, yeah, I think you've got it right on there, Mike. I think 4.5 is where it needs to land.
Cool.
Yep. Which brings us to the next book, which is Pick 3 by Randy Zuckerberg. I looked up Randy Zuckerberg. I was curious, is there a connection to Mark Zuckerberg? And I discovered Randy is Mark Zuckerberg's sister, which I was not expecting. I didn't expect there to really be a connection, but Randy is his sister and used to be the director of market development and a spokesperson for Facebook. So there is a Facebook connection to this one. I did not know that existed. So yes, Pick 3. It's you can have it all, just not every day. That's the tagline on it. That's what we'll go through next time. I think it'll be fun.
All right.
And then
after that, I've got one which is inspired by friend of the show, Jay Miller. We interviewed Jay on the Focus podcast not too long ago, and he talked about this term multi-potentialite, which is interesting to me. And he mentioned a book. He said that he's been wanting us to discuss this on Bookworm. I went back and looked in the recommendations. Jay, you never recommended it, so how could we vote for it?
I say I feel like I've never heard of it, so
I'm just going to pick it since you never added it there.
All right, that works.
So this is How to Be Everything by Emily Wapnick. And I think this is kind of a timely book. A lot of stuff kind of changing in how people work right now. And multi-potentialite is basically somebody who doesn't do just one thing for a living. I kind of think maybe I fall into this category. I kind of want to find out.
Sure.
So that's what we'll do after Pick 3.
Cool. It's kind of interesting. Those two might have a little bit of overlap. So we'll see how that comes together. I do not have a Gap book, Mike. Do you?
I do. And I've started it.
Okay.
It is Get Together, How to Build a Community with Your People by Bailey Richardson, Kevin, I don't know how to say
Hoyne.
Kevin's last name.
Hoyne,
and Kai Elmer Soto. This is a really cool book. It's really well designed. It's very colorful, full color photos, and really cool stories about people building community. I feel like I could do a better job building communities. And I also see the importance of it. So I am about halfway through this one. So far, it's really good, giving me some ideas for Bookworm. But I want to finish the book before we sit down and we talk about them.
You're going to confront me with these?
Maybe.
All right. Let me reread the book we just finished before we do that. Oh, fun times.
All right. So thank you to everybody who is a Bookworm Club member. Like I said, you can go to the club and you can make recommendations, get people to vote for the books for what you want to see us cover. Special thanks to the premium club members who are willing to support us by giving us a couple bucks a month to help keep the lights on. If you want to become a premium member, then you can do so by going to club.bookworm.fm/membership. And you can sign up there. There's monthly and yearly options. Or if you listen to this in Overcast, there's a button at the bottom of your interface, and that'll take you straight to the sign-up page. If you do decide to become a premium club member, you get a couple of bonuses. You get Bookworm FM or Bookworm desktop wallpaper that I created. You get access to some Gap episodes that Joe created and access to all of my MindNode files. I mentioned that a couple times in this episode. I create these crazy mind maps of the books that we read, and I upload those for club members. So join the club if you want to get access to all that stuff.
Yeah, those things are intense. I've looked through those things a few times. It's like, geez, Mike, that takes a lot of time to build those. So kudos to you for putting those together. And thanks to you who are watching us live right now on Twitch. If that's something of interest to you and you want to, critique us as we go along, as folks are doing in the chats, you can catch us on Twitch. These will also be posted to YouTube. The videos will end up on the Bookworm YouTube channel as well. So if you want to watch us as we're having this conversation, you can do that there as well. So if you're reading along with us, pick up Pick 3 by Randy Zuckerberg, and we'll go through it with you next time.